Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Humanities class. And welcome to our next unit, which is going to be on the Enlightenment period, okay? Or the beginning or the kind of transition that we're making into what we would call the modern era, okay? So last time we left off with the conclusion of the Renaissance, the rebirth, the reemergence of artwork and the beloved kind of attitude that people were taking towards the classics. And with that period came a couple new cultural shifts, beginning with the Protestant Reformation, with the emergence of humanism, and so on and so forth. Now, the Enlightenment is, if you want, kind of the cresting peak of those cultural movements in some sense. So what we're going to do with the Enlightenment is we're going to go through a bit of the history and a little bit of the ideology and kind of, noteworthy historical features of this period in history. First, starting with the 1600s. Then, as you can see in the notes, we're going to talk about the 1700s, particularly around the ideologies of that particular time. And then we're going to end with a little piece of music, or a little discussion about music. Now, to begin with, as you can see, we're following along with pretty basic structured notes here. So what do we need to know about the 1600s? Okay, following the conclusion of the Renaissance and this transition into the Enlightenment, as it says here, this century was marked by global expansion. So number one, we have this enormous amount of travel beginning to take place around the world, essentially. So in 1492, we know that Columbus sailed and discovered the New World. So we have this transition over to the New World, over to the East, via the explorers and the traders in Europe, in Central Europe. Okay, so that in and of itself creates a really interesting, what would you call it? A really interesting situation for the change in the development of Western humanities in and of itself. We have more exposure to the East. We have more interplay between the New World now. So we have the whole, issue of how do we deal with, what are we supposed to do with the New World? What do we want to do with it at all? And how is it that we're supposed to approach people who already live there? That whole, issue begins to come up as well. We also have in this time period the emergence of technological innovations, right? So obviously, travel becomes more pronounced in its, skills. We have the ability to navigate a lot easier. The emergence of natural sciences continues to, push forward and forward, as it says here, and natural philosophy as well. So the ingenuity of human beings kind of springing from that spirit of humanism in the Renaissance that we saw really starts to crest and peak here. And people start to be very impressed by the flexing of humanity's intellectual muscles. Now, as we were just saying, yes, science continues. The scientific revolution peaks at this period in history, and it is a continuation of the scientific beliefs and theories from the medieval world. So first and foremost, yes, we need to remember that the scientific revolution was in fact intimately involved in religion, as science always was in the Western world since the medieval era. There was no distinction between the church and science or religion and science per se. The most that you're going to get is going to be towards the end of this Enlightenment period. The ending of this era is where we see the beginning, the seeds of that distinction that we are very familiar with now, this distinction between science and religion. So we'll get there when we get there. But what I wanted you to remember is that as the scientific revolution emerges and begins to take place, it did, and it does have its roots in the medieval view of the cosmos, of the natural world. Because remember, we're coming from a Judeo-Christian worldview, which basically says what? It says that the world is created by an intelligent designer, and that intelligent designer, that divine holy designer, is in fact separate from the created natural physical world. So we are invited, and we are also encouraged in some way to understand the created order around us. That is very clear when you study and you read the letters, the journals of these figures like Newton and Copernicus. They very clearly understand that. They're fascinated by the creation of God. We see that religion is very much driving their scientific spirit, okay? So medieval philosophy, like we just said, kind of goes hand in hand with that. Now, humanism, yes, is starting to play the main role with this too, because we get more and more impressed, we get more and more kind of familiar with our own ability to perceive these natural laws, these natural workings of the cosmos, and how we could actually apply it and use it in our own innovative endeavors. In other words, how can we use our discoveries about the natural world to give ourselves more power, for lack of a better word, power to not only expand ourselves, expand life, and also to enrich life on this planet, okay? Now, the issue of slavery is something that, is not new to the Enlightenment era, but it is something that I like to at least cover during this particular period. Now, why is that? Of course, because with the expansion of the Western world, with the age of expansion, the age of exploration kind of peaking here, what we end up seeing is the conflict that emerges between a world and a civilization like Europe that is very, very developed, and at least its technology, encountering worlds that are far less developed in their technological advances, like people in Africa, like people in Native America in the Americas at this particular time. Now, it becomes more common, and it spreads throughout the colonies that are emerging in the New World that Europe has been establishing. Now, I give us an example of a passage from Bartholomew de las Casas, and a couple things here. So, as slavery becomes to get more widespread, we have a couple different things we need to understand. First and foremost, slavery has existed for all of human history. It was not invented by the colonists, right? It existed everywhere and under everyone, essentially. So it exists, for example, all the way in ancient Mesopotamia. It exists in ancient Egypt. It exists in ancient Greece and in ancient Rome. It existed during the Roman Empire. It exists in sub-Saharan Africa and in the African nations at the time. It existed to a degree even in Native America and in Central American civilizations as well. It exists universal. It is a human universal practice. That is not to say that it is moral. Of course not. I think we all agree and we all understand the basic moral intuition now that slavery is wrong. However, a lot of the world did not believe this. And this is where, if you want, we see another one of these cultural value changes, these dramatic changes in the cultural values between what we would call the modern era and what you might call the post or the pre-modern era. So the more simplified way of seeing that, if you really kind of look through the values of everybody in history, it's post-Christian and pre-Christian. So Christianity emerges and becomes the dominant religion in the Western world. And what ends up happening is you have the issue of slavery becomes something very uncomfortable for us to deal with, right? We have a lot of tension about it. Why is this? Well, if you go back and look at our Christianity unit, what you saw in the letters of St. Paul were if not the explicit instruction to not have slaves, we definitely saw the equation of people who are enslaved with people who are masters, that they have the same value, that they have the same love from God, and they deserve the same level of respect. Well, if that's what St. Paul is saying, if that's what Jesus is kind of illustrating in his parables, you can see the very easy, consistent logic that leads us to the conclusion that I think I can't remember who it was, but there were, I think, two bishops. There were two who ended up being saints, also brothers, during the 3rd century or the 4th century, who actually call for the abolition of slavery all the way back in the 300s. Okay, so like 350 AD, we had people in the church, leaders in the church, saying, "Hey, we should probably get rid of slaves." It's dramatic, right? But that's unheard of in the ancient world, right? Every other civilization around them was saying, "No, we need slaves. We need slaves. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine." These guys come around and say, "No, we probably shouldn't have slaves. We should get rid of this institution." It's amazing. And then, that struggles, obviously, because the weight of that kind of cultural movement is so slow to move, is so difficult to push, that it's not until, you really start kind of getting what happens in the Americas, what happens in Africa, become a little bit more apparent with globalization, with learning, by the way, with literacy, and through technology and all this kind of stuff. People start to see that logic and say, no, this probably we should get rid of this. So that's a quick little kind of overview of the slavery issue. We're going to talk about it more in the 1800s, but for the 1600s right now, what I'd like to illustrate to students, and we're going to illustrate this again, is that slavery in the Americas at this particular time was dramatically different from slavery in Rome, from slavery in the Ottoman Muslim Empire, from slavery in sub-Saharan Africa, from slavery in ancient Rome and in ancient Egypt, ancient Greece. These forms of slavery take dramatically different forms, ladies and gents. So, for example, in ancient Egypt, right, slavery then is brutal, right? You are seen entirely, essentially, as a work animal. You are seen as just someone who, is just in a lower class of society who, we can do what we want with. You see, however, in like a Jewish form of slavery, like indentured servitude, right? That no, you very much are someone with rights and with dignity, but you are paying off a price. So slavery is in and of itself kind of a punishment that will be sentenced out, that you will be kind of worked out of. This is all very different from what we end up seeing in the Americas, in the American colonies, because what ends up happening, as we're going to see towards the end of this unit, ladies and gents, is that we end up actually taking some of the scientific theories that are circulating at this time. We take those theories, we kind of infuse them into society a little bit, and then the people who want to argue for slavery start to have this really grotesque combination of their anthropology, their understanding of anthropology, of human development and science and slavery, and they start to mesh them together into this grotesque belief system that says these people who we can enslave are subhuman, essentially. They are less developed human beings. And that sort of belief exists up until like the end of the American Civil War in the middle of the 1800s. So keep that in mind, like that this is a very unique form of slavery in history, and uniquely kind of wicked in that sense. So before all of that really gets going, we have this figure, Bartolomeu de las Casas, and why do I put him in here? Well, let's take a look and we'll kind of figure this out. He says in his letter here, discussing slavery and discussing kind of what he sees and what's going on. He says this: in this isle, which, as we have said, the Spaniards first attempted, the bloody slaughter and destruction of men first began, for they violently forced away women and children to make them slaves, and ill-treated them, consuming and wasting their food, which they had purchased with great sweat, toil, and yet remained dissatisfied too. And one individual Spaniard consumed more victuals in one day than when served to maintain 3 families a month, every one consisting of 10 persons, now being oppressed by such evil usage and afflicted with such great torments and violent entertainment, they began to understand that such men as those had not their mission from heaven. Okay, so Saint Bartolomeu de las Casas is discussing what here? How does he characterize the treatment of the Native Americans that he is with? So this is a Roman Catholic at that particular time. I can't remember if he was a bishop or a priest or what he was, but he's definitely in the Roman Catholic clergy. He goes to the Americas and he sees the treatment of the Native Americans there, and how by the Spanish. And how does he think? What does he think about it? You can just see it right there. He says it's evil, it's tormenting, it's torturous. It is very clearly inconsistent with any mission that would come from heaven, as his religion would understand it. So he sees the treatment of these people as incredibly unjust and evil and wicked. Okay, now, why might he be so strongly against this behavior? Well, we kind of just said this, ladies and gents, because he's a Catholic Christian. Because Christians believe what? If they're being consistent, if they're really being consistent and looking at what their texts and their founder, Jesus of Nazareth and Paul of Tarsus, and all these kind of guys, what it is that they're actually teaching, which is what? Human value is universal. Every human being is of equal intrinsic value to God, essentially. Now, that in of itself, we want to just kind of step back for a minute. That in of itself is a dramatic belief. And I mean, a lot of people, like we, again, being in a kind of essentially a post-Christian culture that we're in right now, that's shocking to hear, right? That is such a shocking thing to understand in the ancient world, because traditionally, what gave you value in a world or in a culture at that particular, depending on where you are, but generally speaking, it has something to do with your tribe, your station in that tribe, and what you could offer to that tribe, like whether it's with money, whether it's with your services, your wisdom, all that kind of stuff. So in other words, what you can do, where you are in society, and who you are in terms of like your sexuality, your gender, all this kind of stuff, that sort of thing, these things determine your value. Well, since Jesus and St. Paul, you have this movement of a religion which basically at its core, one of its fundamental claims about human beings says what? No, all human beings are equally valued, irrespective of where they are in society, who they are in terms of their immutable characteristics, sex, gender, all this kind of stuff, and also what they can offer. It doesn't matter what they can offer. You still have value. So you could be literally like, Elon Musk, versus you could literally be like the guy, dying of a heroin overdose underneath the bridge, on East Avenue. And Christianity says you have equal value no matter what. That's dramatically contrary to what the world was saying at that time. And so Bartolomé de las Casas comes along and he sees his fellow Spaniards, who in theory should also be Catholic and also be Christian, he sees them behaving this way inconsistently with his very clear, I think, and consistent understanding of his religion. And he thinks it's appalling. Okay, so why does he feel so strongly? Why might he be so strongly against this behavior? It's because he's a Christian, because this behavior and the beliefs that underline it and kind of push it forward, the beliefs that make you think that slavery or the treatment of slaves is okay, this is dramatically against Christianity. Okay, so I like using Bartolomé de las Casas because he, again, sort of, breaks our simplistic understanding of history, where we think, oh, like, everyone in Europe went over and they just enslaved everybody and they're just all a bunch of evil people, all this kind of stuff. It's like, did they do it? Yes, they very clearly did it. Did it go unopposed? 100% no. Okay, so that's why I like to say it, from the beginning of its roots, the roots of slavery in the New World, the Catholic Church is against it. And we have actually Bartolomé de las Casas, writing this letter to the clergy. Eventually, the Pope actually, of his time, actually, elicits this edict, basically saying that slavery is a sin, it's evil, in the 1500s, right? So, in terms of moral developments, right, we see that the waves that are going to eventually wash over the injustice of slavery kind of begin here, or have already begun to kind of take place. It's a really interesting, fascinating line of history to follow, right? The development of our beliefs about slavery, about oppression, about all this kind of stuff. It's not as simple as we usually like to make it out to be. Okay, meanwhile, speaking of which, we move now into the character of John Locke. So what is it that John Locke's doing? What's going on with him? Where's his name? Oh, he doesn't have a name. Doesn't have a title. So John Locke, what's he all about? Well, like the text says, meanwhile, during this period, not only is there the expansion, the emergence of sciences, all this kind of stuff, but there's also the development and the continuation of changes, let's put it that way, in people's philosophy. So many philosophers were thinking critically about what idea? Human rights and just human nature overall, okay? A classic question, a classic sort of topic of philosophy. What is the nature of human beings, right? And do human beings have inherent rights? So you kind of see what's happening here. We're moving historically from this period, or these centuries of time where people are more spread out, and the biggest kind of populations you would have are within some kind of massive empire, which has smaller provinces, which have smaller towns, like all this kind of stuff. And people are interacting on a law-based level there, and they're trying to kind of enact and follow the laws of those particular tribes and those particular empires, et cetera, et cetera. Now we're getting into the more globalized sort of mentality where, okay, we now have interaction with not empires necessarily, but huge nations and huge swaths of people, like millions of people, how are we going to understand this question of, well, what rights does someone have as a human being? Do human beings have intrinsic rights? Okay. John Locke comes on the scene and he basically formulates this, that human beings have an inherent and innate right to life, liberty, and property. Okay, so interesting moral theory. So, what does it mean to have an inherent right? It means that simply by existing, by you just being alive, you have, number one, a right to be alive, right? You have a right to actually continue living. No one, therefore, can take that away from you. That would be a violation against your rights. This is a violation against nature. You also have a right to liberty, to kind of do as you wish. And that's where the complications of this philosophy can always come in. Like, okay, well, what are the limits on your liberty? What are the limits on your liberty when it comes to affecting other people's liberty and life and all that kind of stuff? And you also have a right to own property, okay? Whether that be your own food, your own clothes, your own home, your own shelter, your own weapons, all this kind of stuff, that comes into play as well. These are fundamental human rights that you cannot take away. John Locke, of course, believes that these come from a divine source. And as you know, you kind of know where this is going, right? It's going to end up becoming one of the main inspirational lines, or at least ideas, behind the American Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, rather, where we see that this formulation, or this kind of culmination of this idea that, hey, everybody has a fundamental right given by God. Everybody, like universal human rights, is a thing. Okay, so let's take a look at a passage from Mr. John Locke real quick. He says, "The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone. And reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind, who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. And when his own preservation comes not in competition, ought he, as much as he can, to preserve the rest of mankind, and may not, unless it be to do justice on another offender, take away or impair the life, or that tends to or what tends to the preservation of the life, the liberty, health, limb, or goods of another." Okay, so in other words, there's that formulation of what we were just trying to discuss there, how we all, essentially, according to John Locke, have a right to not have those rights within us infringed. You cannot infringe upon my life, my liberty, and my property, albeit withstanding I haven't infringed on yours, I haven't infringed on everybody else's, okay? So that's kind of an easy, we can summarize that in a lot of different ways, but my interesting question to you, ladies and gentlemen, is, do you agree with that? Do you agree with John Locke's fundamental claim? If you do agree with it, you can see where it's going, right? You can see the roots of the American idea beginning to formulate here. If you do not agree with it, well, tell me why. And same thing, if you agree with it, tell me why. Why do you think people have this inherent right? How are you going to enforce that? All this kind of stuff. Where do you think this comes from? Who are you to say that this thing exists? And if you don't, explain to me why. Why do you think that this is wrong? Where do you think it's wrong? To what degree do you think it is wrong? Explain for me why. Okay. Now, let's leave it there. There's a couple more things we could say about John Locke, but I don't want to say it just yet. Okay, so more philosophers. Yeah, more philosophers are coming behind the wake of John Locke here. So the Enlightenment is notorious, for students at least, in having a plethora of different philosophers and thinkers, all of whom have their own unique philosophies and views. I, however, as you're going to see, I'm only going to give you three of them, three of the most, I think, noteworthy and interesting for us to grapple with right here. Okay. Now, the first one is Mr. Voltaire. Voltaire believes, essentially, number one, that man is corrupt, right? That there is something corrupted in human nature, that there's something wrong with human nature. And therefore, society, in other words, the action of human beings trying to live together in order, will therefore be corrupt too. Okay? He also says, as a final note here, that we should eliminate superstition and fanaticism, right? We should get rid of the kind of simplistic, dogmatic, irrational beliefs that permeate our culture and our belief systems. Okay, and fanaticism as well, like violence and kind of extremism within our beliefs. So you can kind of see again, whether it be with John Locke, Voltaire, and with these other two boys we're going to talk about, you can sort of see how every one of these guys is essentially responding or is essentially kind of a child of the historical eras that came before them. Now, what came before us? Again, remember, it is the Renaissance. And what were the roots of the Renaissance essentially planted in? It was the medieval era. So from the medieval era, we have a really long, millennia essentially of Christianity and all the cultural kind of movements and beliefs surrounding that religion, really culminating and making up the soil of that period of history. Out of that soil grows the Renaissance. Now, as we begin to grow more and more and develop more and more from the Renaissance, we start to turn back on these beliefs and we start to question them a little bit more and maybe try to either reform them, tweak them, come to terms with them, or entirely reject them. And that is kind of what we see with a lot of these guys. They are responding to their cultural and philosophical roots in many different ways. So Voltaire is looking at his religious society and look at what he's saying. He's like, yes, I accept this belief that man is corrupt, right? So in terms of the views and beliefs of history, Voltaire is not really saying anything too controversial or too new there. It's like everyone kind of always accepted that human beings had this level of corruption, a level of tragic weakness within them, right? And therefore society will always be kind of imperfect as well. But I think what Voltaire is also responding to is the religious kind of violence and fanaticism that he saw on the wake of the Protestant Reformation and all the different kind of conflicts that trickled down through the centuries that led to his birth. And he doesn't like it. And he says we should probably get rid of that, right? Now, this could lead to hardcore atheism if you want to keep pushing it. Like, then this is the typical atheist move, or one of the cultural reasons why someone might become an atheist is they will see the conflicts in their culture, in their world, that seem to be fundamentally motivated by religion, and they will want to therefore throw the whole thing out, right? Just kind of get rid of this. Let's carve this part of our culture out, and we will be, without a problem. Again, we discussed in the Renaissance period, though, that runs a danger. There's a danger in doing that, of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And we will see how that actually becomes a little bit more apparent towards the end of the Enlightenment. So stay tuned. Rousseau. What is Mr. Rousseau saying? He says man is essentially good, actually. He is departing from what Voltaire says and what I would argue probably the vast majority of human beings throughout the classical collection of wisdom would say. He rejects this. He says, no, humans are essentially good in nature. It is society that is evil and corrupting. Interesting. So society, this desire to kind of like constrain people, this desire to kind of order and control people, that is what is evil. That is what is messing us up. We should strive against society's influence and help everybody, right? So you could kind of see in some sense that spirit of independence that we discussed in the Renaissance, that spirit of revolutionary independence, definitely being present in Rousseau. And he is quite different and quite of an outlier here because he is completely rejecting the whole kind of idea of man's inherent corruption and sin and all this kind of stuff. He's saying, no, if you just kind of leave people isolated from society, they will actually be good, moral, and virtuous. It is all these other influences on us that make us wicked and evil. Interesting sociological and anthropological theory. Next, we have Immanuel Kant, who is a little bit different because he's not talking too much about anthropology, but he's more interested in ethics and morals. So what does Kant come to say? He says, man must act good, even without religion. So we must, in other words, we are compelled, we have to do this. We have to be moral, irrespective of what we believe, irrespective of, what your theories about humanity are. You need to act morally. And we should be able to do that even without religion, right? We should be able to turn away from religion. We don't need the Bible and all these, kind of pontificating people in the clergy to tell us, to instruct us on how to be good, right? We can figure it out essentially with our own reason and our own understanding, and therefore kind of lessen the need for religion. Here we see a little bit of Kant's appeal to the secularists, right? This is where secularism becomes much, much more of a present player and a present philosophy is during the Enlightenment, right? A lot of the Enlightenment figures were secularists, were people who did not think that we needed to involve religion in our political discussions, in our cultural discussions, or in our culture in general, right? It should be kept private. Religion should be a private thing. Okay, what does he say? We must treat everyone as an end and not a means to our end. So basic ethics right there, except it's not, okay? This is something that a lot of critics of the Enlightenment and of these thinkers will kind of say, and we're going to see this again as one of the things I like to teach my students, is that at the very kind of roots and foundations of our civilization and our culture, for the past 250, maybe 300 years, there has been this tension between what we've kind of inherited from our past eras of history, from our past eras and their philosophies, and what we're trying to do. There's this tension between them where we're trying to figure out, what do we need to reform, what do we need to get rid of, what happens if we get rid of too much, and all this kind of stuff. Kant is, as you can kind of see, claiming this, or kind of instructing people to follow this type of ethic. Except the problem here is, you could critique Kant and say, where is he getting these ethics from? Where does this kind of ethical framework from, this selfless sort of communal-centered ethic? And some critics will look at Kant and say, dude, it's because you're a Christian. You come from a Christian culture that heavily values these sort of things. There are other cultures in the world, in the global community, that don't have those type of values, that have very different, more individualistic and more kind of self-interested sort of ones, more classist. So this kind of smuggling in, or this kind of use of the Christian ethics without the actual practice and beliefs of Christianity becomes a major critique of the Enlightenment. A lot of people who don't like the Enlightenment, who call it the Endarkenment, all this kind of stuff, will say that that is essentially what the Enlightenment is doing. It's trying to kind of take the morals that it likes from Christianity that help create a stable and equal society, and maintain those by also kind of getting rid of all the other kind of religious beliefs of Christianity. And their claim is that not only is that bad, is that insincere, or is that irrational, illogical, but it's going to cause problems because of its illogic, because of its inconsistency. It's going to end up causing serious problems down the road. And that's an interesting critique, and we can kind of discuss that a little bit more as we go on. Now, when it comes to, let's see, the notes. So we discussed their critical thoughts, and I asked you here, which do you agree with the most and why? So out of, whether it's John Locke, Kant, Voltaire, or Rousseau, which one do you think is closest to the truth? And explain why, right? Tell me why. Which one of these guys do you think has a strong view on human nature that you think is correct, and explain why, okay? Where do you fit in the different schools of thought within the Enlightenment era? Okay, now, La Revolution, here we go. So, as we discussed, all of these new ideas, all of these conflicts that we see happening in the world, through the expansion, through colonization, through monarchy, through all this sort of stuff, through the kind of explosion of population and the explosion of technology and means and travel and all this stuff, we start to have revolutions for different reasons, okay? So let's begin with probably the one you're all familiar with, which is the American Revolution. The United States of America and its revolution began, as it says here, on the part of the colonies of the British Empire, waging war against its oppressive rule, right? The colonies did not like the way that the British were ruling them at the time, that King George was ruling them. They said that there was unfair taxation, and that they had enslaved others, themselves and the literal slaves, and that it was enacting or was kind of enforcing religious oppression, right? This enforced sort of religious kind of treatment that you needed to follow a certain religion. You were not able to go and seek your own religious freedom as pilgrims. Okay, so real quick, we're going to contrast the two, right? So get the basic gist of this one down. Now, a couple things here. The American Revolution is unique in that sense because it is in some sense a pure product of both the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, in the sense that, yeah, the Renaissance had kind of set up all of the, what would you call it? All of the philosophical and cultural groundwork that will eventually develop into the Enlightenment, which will then push the American Revolution forward. It set the cultural standard for that. In what ways? Well, like we said, we don't like this whole oppressive rule thing, right? With the emergence of more and more people and more globalization, you have more territory. You have more space for people to seek their own path and govern themselves. That's the kind of, initial spirit of the American Revolution. And we don't like this kind of oppressive taxation, practice that is essentially a leftover system that was being abused and was not being used properly, all this kind of stuff from the feudal system of the medieval era. So we have this very clear kind of rejection of an older historical way of doing things, and we desire something a little bit different. Now, it is worth saying, again, to kind of point out little details within history, that the American Revolution in its original documents did actually find the treatment of slaves by King George as something negative. They didn't like it, actually. Jefferson famously, in his first draft of the American Revolution, or of the Declaration of Independence, said that King George has, acted against God's children and enslaved them unjustly like a tyrant, all this kind of stuff, referring to the people of Africa is what he says. Now, that sort of implies, and it did imply, that the people who signed that document, the 13 colonies, would need to therefore sign off on the eradication of slavery in their opening document. So, whoa, like that's a huge little kind of revelation that I love to drop on students, because again, one of these little myths we have about history is that, like, oh, it was like all 13 colonies, were totally entrenched in slavery and nobody was against slavery, all this kind of stuff. Again, ladies and gentlemen, it was just like with Bartolome de las Casas, or 200 years after him, people were not comfortable entirely with slavery. Were there people who were entirely comfortable with it and wanted it to be a thing? Absolutely. Were there a lot of people who were also uncomfortable with it? Of course. And so what we ended up seeing was that, no, Jefferson's that first draft gets amended. That has to be taken out. Why? Because 11 of the 13 colonies wanted it in. We're like, fine, yeah, keep it in. There were 2 that did not. 2 colonies of the 13 American colonies wanted slavery to stay in. So, I mean, like, not to get too off on a tangent, but just like, again, let that sink in for a minute, is that this country, America, the majority of the colonies did not want slavery in the country. We're okay with getting rid of it in the beginning. And just a little, the 2 of them that did not sign this, that did not sign off on this, did not want it. Why did they, get to keep that? Why did those 2, ended up have the winning vote? Because the Congress, I think it was Adams and Jefferson, comment about this in one of their letters, basically say, we need everyone to be on board with this. We need all 13 colonies to enact this war of independence. And if we don't have these 2 with us, King George will just enlist them, and then we will be more likely to lose. So get him on board. And he says, I think in the same letter, that we will have to deal with this slavery issue down the road, and it's going to be a major issue. Which it was, that was in 1776 or 1770, I can't remember. 1776. And then in essentially 100 years, kaboom, right? You have a civil war over the issue. So, good foreshadowing for that conflict, right here. Now, that's the American Revolution. Meanwhile, you have in Europe the French Revolution taking place. And as it says here, it was a revolt on the part of the lower class of France against the seemingly, and quite honestly it was, decadent monarchy of the upper class for its concentration of power and wealth. Okay, So people are not liking how the upper class, the wealth, the monarchy are behaving, are treating them, and all this kind of stuff. They are really clinging to their authority in a very kind of corrupt, feudalistic sort of way. With the emergence of more and more technology, more abundance of wealth, more population, more territory, and new ideas and movements of philosophy and religion, we start to become uncomfortable with this. Okay. Now, to look at this real quick, let's take actually, before we do the full comparison, let's see what the results of the American Revolution are before you, you know, if you're in America, the formulation of the United States of America. So as a successful war, after a successful war, the colonies established what is now the USA government, the United States of American government, that would eventually expand westward into a 50-state country, right? And then, you know, to pat ourselves on the back, it ends up going on to become one of, if not the most powerful nations in history, in the history of the world, okay? So pretty good. You know, it worked out pretty good, right? Their revolution was a success. They established a very unique system of government. You know, we know the three branches, checks and balances, all this kind of stuff. And it's a success. Okay. And there's one civil war, right? The country almost collapses and almost kind of goes nuts on itself. We'll discuss that and why in a little while. Meanwhile, in France, you know, how did this go? It ends with the destabilization of French society and then the reign of the emperor, the tyrant Napoleon afterwards. So after this chaotic and incredibly violent upheaval of society, this revolution of lower class against the upper class, whether that's the nobles, the monarchs, the church, everyone, you know, it just kind of goes nuts on these people. The French government was seized by a tyrant and promised to end the chaos that expanded, to end the chaos and expand the country. Okay, now my DC friends, well, my DC fans will notice that, or probably have heard that a really good depiction, or kind of good, you know, fictional depiction of the French Revolutionary pattern of history and spirit can be seen in like The Dark Knight Rises, right? This kind of rising up, this anarchical rising up of the lower class to overthrow a tyrannical upper class. That is very much the French Revolution spirit. Okay. So in other words, it devolves from its original intention, and it eventually gives rise to a tyrant, to an emperor in Napoleon, right? And there's Napoleon down there, famous little scene. I like these two contrasting scenes, by the way. This is George Washington. I can't remember what the exact painting is, but I'm trying to depict here the idea of George Washington being elected president, being offered this 4-year term as president, after he, by the way, rejects the opportunity to become the king, right? His certain members of the government, of the party, wanted him to become the king. And he says, no, I will become the president and I will give up my power in 4 years, which he does, you know, setting this amazing example of the abdication of power, right? That we go all the way back to the medieval era. Where have we seen that before? It's like, oh, that sounds a lot like King Arthur. That sounds a lot like the noble king, the one who lays down their power and sacrifices it when the time comes. Versus someone like Napoleon, who I love this picture because what's going on with Napoleon here? You got the Pope over here, I think it's the Pope, and then you got Napoleon here crowning himself the emperor, basically. Now, what is going on there? Usually it was the Pope who would crown you, right? Kind of, you know, a la what we talked about in the medieval era. Pope crowns you king. Napoleon walks up, grabs the crown away from the king, or I'm sorry, away from the Pope, and then crowns himself king, right? Really fantastically iconic sort of tyrannical move there. It's great. So really quickly now, what are the similarities and differences here? Okay. There are similarities in the geographical layout of these revolutions, right? One is happening within a country right next to its government. The other one is happening, you know, hundreds and hundreds of miles apart from across the Atlantic Ocean. So that's going to play a big role. Another big difference here. There is a difference in the motivation in some sense. The motivation of the colonies is essentially something like self-governance away from the King of England, whereas the general sense of the French Revolution is simply just a reaction against in the desire to overthrow a government. The Americas had no interest in overthrowing King George where he was. They just wanted him to get out of where they were now. They're like, get out, you know, don't expand into our what is now our territory, according to us. Okay. Now, similarities. We see the conflict of people against tyranny. That's a really simple one. We see the kind of progression away from feudalism and into more contemporary forms of government. Okay, we see that. I'll leave that as the only ones that I'll discuss here, but I want you to, again, go and take a look at what other similarities you could see, what other differences you can see. Now, after this, you know, like we always do with the humanities, I usually have my students take a look at music, at some form of art, right? We haven't looked at music yet, or talked about it because it's different, it's stranger, right? It's very alien to us if you look at music before the medieval period. I'm sorry, before the Enlightenment. So what I like to do is have my students listen to these three great musical geniuses of their time, whether it's Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and I've given you, let's see, 1, 2, 3 different pieces that if you're going to sample these guys ever, you should definitely look at this, right? Whether it's, you know, a cello suite, whether it's a mass, whether it's a whole symphony, or at least a part of a symphony, I would like you to take a look at those, okay? Now, I can't do them for you here, right? Because that would be a little bit just long-winded. But what I have my students do is, again, go listen to these. And how do you listen to music, by the way? You don't walk around, you know, in the gym, or you don't walk around in school and put your headphones in and listen to this stuff. No, you go find a nice room, preferably a nice room with like good acoustics. Make sure it's quiet. Make sure you're relaxed. Make sure you're not looking at your phone. Make sure you're not stuffing food down your face. Relax, lay down for a minute, you know, put your head down, close your eyes, and play the music in a comfortable volume, and try to allow yourself to be moved by the music, okay? And just get a real good, intimate sense of what does this music feel like? What is this music doing? And why were these pieces so beloved and so revolutionary for their time? What is it that's so transfixing and arresting about these pieces of music, okay? And what I've asked you to do here is basically just tell me, describe the music to me, describe kind of how you would articulate it to someone who's never heard it before. And then tell me which artist and which of these pieces is your favorite out of those three, right? Who's got the best piece of music, or the best ear and, you know, mind for music, and which piece particularly is your favorite, okay? Tell me why as well. All right. So ladies and gents, that is a really quick discussion overview of the first 200 years-ish, right? The first 100 years, right? Yeah, the first 100 or so years of the Renaissance, of the Enlightenment period. I'm really out of it today. And what we're going to do in the next video is we're only going to have 2 videos on the Enlightenment. We're going to discuss the later parts of the 1800s and all of the continuous upheaval in that period, as well as some more of the philosophical innovations or the philosophical changes that we see happening at that time. And then we're going to conclude with some discussion about the famous novels of this period in history, okay? Or the emergence of novels in general, all right? Until then, I will see you next time. In the meantime, have a great day. Thank you.